I want to encourage you to watch the video all the way through. I'm going to be explaining to you why the stock market's probably going to go a little bit lower, but then bottom out and rise. S&P is probably going to make a new high. NASDAQ's probably going to go back up and fill the gap at 20,400. Show you why I think that. You can draw your own conclusions, but I'm going to show you compelling evidence that we could see a bottom surrounding the Fed meeting that will go up and give us a counter trend for NASDAQ and maybe new highs for the S&P. My guess is that's probably going to be the case. I think we are in a bottoming process. So watch the video all the way through. In my last video, I'll link it at the end of this one, I went through the weekly, daily, and the hourly charts, and I showed you what was going on. In this video, I'm going to show you why I think that bottom, as I talked about in the last video, could form, but I think we're going to violate the trend lines a little bit further, and I'll show you why. Change all the time. But before I start, I just want to express my condolences. There was another attack on Israel, and 11 children playing soccer in a soccer field were struck by rockets. 29 other children have been injured and hospitalized. Just so sad. My heart just out for these little children and their families that now have to deal with the loss of a child. So our thoughts and prayers are with them and the families that were hurt in this horrible attack. Please support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. If you like the indicators, if you like the charts, please let me know that by supporting the channel. I need your help in order to make it work. Just put it all out there for free and ask that you just do what you can to help out. I need to hear from you. If you could take a moment, step up to the plate and help out, I would really appreciate that. Money made on YouTube is through the channels, is through sponsorship. I don't want to do that because I don't want to sell you a bunch of stuff. Send you to websites that want to overcharge you for things. Just ask that you do what you can to help out, but I need to hear from you in order to make it work. If you can take a moment to do that, I would really appreciate it. The link below, it'll take you to a secured site and you can donate any amount you want. Thank you for your consideration for that. I'm going to be talking about in this video, I'm going to be talking about why I think you got a shot at a bottom. You're either going to get a continuation with the Fed down to 3,900 on the S&P or 17,000 on NASDAQ, or you're going to get a bottom. Okay, I think we go lower, form a bottom in all likelihood. Need to see evidence of that. Have that yet, but I'm going to show you have evidence of it. Bitcoin that has a negative correlation with the market, that it's suggesting a top is developing again. The reason why I think the stock market rallies is take a look at my risk-reward model. It's come up here to extremes, okay, as we've sold off, okay, and be suggesting a sideways move. It's gone back up. We were rallying a little bit, and then we turned back down. Be suggesting a sideways move. It could mean that we have a few more weeks of upside to go back and fill the gaps. So NASDAQ can fill the gaps and get a lower high. S&P can go up and make a higher high, slam into the trend line, form a divergence with Bitcoin. So suggesting to me that we might attempt to form bottoms surrounding the Fed, that we still might have more upside because it's not rolling over yet. The fact that it's going back and forth suggests to me a sideways kind of topping process move. As I said, NASDAQ's just above that trend line, and again, either hit it or go beyond it, and I think you can bottom out and get a rebound back up to fill the gaps. And again, here, the risk-reward model is still pointing upward. Even though we've been going down for the last 3 weeks, you're suggesting a sideways topping process could mean that we go up here to extremes still, try to fill those gaps. So just some things that I'm looking at, looking for clues, going to break and move sharply lower. Head and shoulder patterns right now, try to bounce surrounding the trend lines or violating them, and then try to bounce. Bitcoin just recently did backfill the gaps and get a larger topping process. Just some things I'm looking at. I want to share that with you. Now, the S&P 500, it breached this trend line ever so slightly and then closed back above it just a little bit. I think there's still a very good chance we're going to go a little bit lower. You have the possibility of divergences forming with the 4-hour charts of futures and on the 60-minute charts of the S&P 500 cash, along with NASDAQ cash. Those divergences are likely going to form. We're going to get another push down. And then I think we're going to rebound back up. And right now we're trying to bounce off the 38.2 Fibonacci, 38.2% Fibonacci of this advance right here from the low here in, I believe it was April. We have two trend lines that I'm watching. Again, this trend line has now been slightly breached. NASDAQ's just above it. I think it's going to break it, but then I think it's going to bottom out. Trend lines do change all the time. But one thing I want to continue to point out to you, you don't have to like Bitcoin. But remember I told you on July 5th, Bitcoin was bottoming. Bitcoin bottomed July 5th when my signal said it bottomed. The stock market's going to peak right after that. What happened right after that? July 10th, NASDAQ peaked. I told you the market was going to get a sell-off and Bitcoin was going to rally big time. Bitcoin rallied big time. Bitcoin's now topping. You're probably going to get a bottom with the S&P. If you watch the video all the way through, the Fed meetings have been calling the turns with Bitcoin and the S&P. The last time it marked a top on Bitcoin, continuation on the S&P, a top on Bitcoin, the stock market can rally back up. Again, they have currently a negative correlation as they're diverging from one another, which is suggesting a major top is developing in the stock market and with Bitcoin. Bitcoin can't make new highs. You don't have to like cryptocurrency. You don't have to like Bitcoin, but it's going to give you information on the stock market. And just as I told you, the stock market was going to go down and play catch up to Bitcoin. We've seen NASDAQ drop 9.5%, probably going to go down a little bit further, but then we can go back and fill those gaps. Bitcoin tops right now, which I'm getting topping signals for Bitcoin, getting a bottom next week surrounding the Fed. The stock market, currently they have a negative correlation. Eventually, the divergences are done if we get a topping process, which I believe we are in with the stock market and with Bitcoin. It will lead to a reversal with both, as I've talked about at great length and detail. Here, look at this chart. This is the trend line from the October 2023 low. Now, I think we're going to break it, but trend lines, I think we're going to end up going back up and going higher and then come back down and break whatever trend line forms right there. That's what I think is likely going to be the case. You know, when we had the trend line right here in 2022, we broke it. Okay, we broke it and we violated it and we went a little bit lower. Trend lines change all the time and it ended up forming a larger channel, eventually a rising wedge pattern that we have developing S&P 500 in the weekly time frame that I've talked about at great length and detail. Here's what I want to show you. Look at this. Again, I think we're going to go down lower, but then I think we're going to rebound back up. I think you're going to carve out a bottom in the market, okay? Again, these two trend lines from October of 2022, eventually we're going to come back down to that level. But this trend line right here, we're breaking it. I think we're going to carve out another bottom and end up getting back above it. That's what Bitcoin just did. And I'm just telling you, look, like Bitcoin, but Bitcoin, the market is following Bitcoin. It peaked NASDAQ 3 weeks ago and it followed Bitcoin lower. Bitcoin was bottoming, the market was topping. Now Bitcoin had the big rally back up, the market had the sell-off. Bitcoin, I'm getting topping signals on Bitcoin again. Tops, guess what? The stock market's probably going to bottom. This trend line or a little bit lower. Now, why do I say that? You know, all the trend lines, you know, it slightly broke already, but we got back above it. I think it will be broken. Get a breach here, but then I think we'll end up getting back above it. This is the linear scaling. Look at what happened with Bitcoin. Look at these two trend lines, the October 2022 low and the October 2023 low. Bitcoin has very similar, has trend lines with bottoms very close to those levels. Now again, these charts are linear scaling, okay? Showing you, look at the linear scaling with Bitcoin. It broke the blue trend line right there. And again, I think that NASDAQ and S&P are probably going to get a decisive break like Bitcoin did, but then it got back above it. I got bottoming signals. I think I'll see bottoming signals form on the NASDAQ and S&P, and I think we'll get back above it and we'll get the rally like Bitcoin. If Bitcoin forms a lower high right here, then you have this divergence between the S&P and the stock market. And if Bitcoin, I'm getting topping signals now. I think Bitcoin goes up a little higher to the 71,000 area. And I think it comes back and it breaks this trend line right here. And I think it's over for Bitcoin. If it diverges, I think the S&P will go higher. It will rally back up to fill the gaps, get the lower high, and then I think Bitcoin will come back down and end up breaking the trend line here and eventually moving back to the trend line here. Now, they both bottomed in October 2023 here with the higher low. Bitcoin actually bottomed right here in September of 2023, got the higher low in October. And I'm taking that accelerated trend line from that level. The November level over here in 2022, the market bottomed in October of 2022, Bitcoin in November of 2023. But you have these trend lines. So again, if Bitcoin broke the trend line and bottomed out right after that, what do you think the stock market's probably going to do? Probably do what Bitcoin just did. It broke the trend line, and then it rebounded back up and went back and tested the highs. NASDAQ is probably going to get a lower high to fill the gap at 20,400. S&P probably moved to a higher high, and Bitcoin's probably going to get a lower high here and diverge. But if we start seeing Bitcoin begin to turn down next week with the Fed, which I believe we will, Bitcoin's been topping with the Fed meetings, and we had the May low bottom with the Fed meeting. The stock market can bottom, and we can get a rally back up. Are you picking up what I'm throwing down? This is priceless. This is amazing. People aren't aware this is going on. I follow both Bitcoin and the stock market, so I've been watching them both closely and been noticing these relationships. I believe the stock market's in a topping process. Why do I believe that? Because the Fed's going to pivot, and I believe that pivot's going to come September 18th. It's broken out. It's back tested. It's testing a major trend line right now. It's going to start surging back up, and the stock market's going to go down, and Bitcoin's going to go down in a topping process. I believe that a bottom, just as I called the bottom for Bitcoin over here in early July, I think the stock market's going to probably bottom next week. You're going to rally back up to new highs on S&P, and I think you're going to get a lower high on NASDAQ. You're going to get short covering there, down at the lows. I think you're going to get by the dip crowd coming back in, and I think they're going to run the stock market back up, and Bitcoin is going to top out again, probably surrounding the Fed meeting and with the Bitcoin conference here that's been going on the last few days. Going higher on the hype, as I correctly predicted this bottom on the 25th. I predicted the pullback and the bottom here. Been making absolutely amazing Bitcoin calls over and over as we've been going sideways, but I believe we're going to get into the top here. And I'll link my latest Bitcoin video. If you want to go see the signals on Bitcoin, pretty amazing. I don't know what the market's going to do. Watch Bitcoin because, again, they have currently a negative correlation. Again, possible we bottom around here. There is here with NASDAQ, again, a trend line from the October 2023 low. We're right above it right now. If we break it, there's another trend line going back to the January 2023 low right here that we could come into contact with or come down towards, which, again, gap fill at 18,600. 1.8 Fibonacci of this advance right here is at this advance right here is at 18,000, just under 18,400. And that's right in where this trend line is coming into play, which again, we could violate this trend line and still rebound, get back above it, and go back and fill the gap all the way back up here to 20,400. If in fact we can bounce, if we break the trend line as Bitcoin did. Now again, NASDAQ, you've got a trend line way back here from the October low to the January low, and that's pointing way down here at 13,000. But the Fed meeting coming up, we're either going to get a bottom or continuation of the trend. Okay, we've already had a peak. So with the Fed meeting next week, this week I should say, you're going to get a continuation of the trend or you're going to get a bottom. If Bitcoin's topping, the stock market might bottom or get a continuation of the trend to play catch up with Bitcoin. So what I'm watching is, does that happen? Does the stock market just break this level and just keep going? And we got this head and shoulders and we move down to the 200. That's it. We don't fill the gaps and we just, see this big collapse. Possibly, but I think it's more likely we bottom and go back and fill those gaps first. And you see that divergence between Bitcoin and the S&P 500. Keep saying institutions are going to make that decision. If they stop selling, we can get a bottom. You'll see short covering. And you'll see the buy the dip crowd come in. We've had distribution here, which we were told there was no possible way that happens. So again, I'll be watching the trend line. Do we just slightly violate it? Or maybe move closer to this trend line right here? And we'll be watching to see if we attempt to get a recovery. But again, at the Fed meeting, we're either going to get a continuation of this trend downward. The decision's not going to be made by me. It's not going to be made by you. It's going to be made by the institutions. Stop selling. Then the buy the dip crowd can come back in and we can rise back up on lighter volume, fill these gaps right here now. And if we are topping, there's a good chance that happens. Watching, going into the Fed meeting next week, do we get a continuation and end up forming the head and shoulders right now? Or do we go back and try to fill those gaps, maybe go a little bit lower and try to bottom in the 18,000 range on NASDAQ? You got a good shot that that's going to be the case. And because Bitcoin bottomed and the market sold off, I think there's a very good chance that, again, we violate the trend line like Bitcoin did, but then get back above it. And we got this massive rally back up, which I correctly predicted, the bottom on Bitcoin and the rebound back up I'm getting warning signs at a top. I still think Bitcoin goes to 70, 71,000, near this, closer to this trend line. But then again, peak out. And you say, shut up about Bitcoin already. I'm not interested in Bitcoin. Well, you should be. And look at the divergences between Bitcoin and the stock market. The S&P in the lower window, Bitcoin in the upper window. Okay, they diverge from one another at turning points. I told you I'm looking topping process to complete. Don't think it's done yet with the S&P. I do think it's still under construction with NASDAQ, but NASDAQ likely peaked along with NVIDIA already. That on July 11th. There's a very good chance that I thought the stock market just peaked with the NASDAQ on July 10th. I still think that. Warning signals before July 10th, on July 10th and 11th of a major reversal. Warned you about the Bitcoin bottom on July 5th, early July, as the bottom was forming the higher low. Again, Bitcoin is forming a divergence with the S&P. I think the S&P could go a little lower and bottom out, still go back up. Bitcoin tops out. You have this divergence between the two, just like we had back over here, and all these other tops and bottoms over and over again. 2018, 2019, 2021, over and over and over again. These divergences have marked turns with both Bitcoin and the S&P 500. Why? Because Bitcoin is the asset with the most volatility. NASDAQ has peaked, so again, we'll be watching that. Now, the other thing is the Fed meeting's coming up. Fed meeting has been calling the turns with both Bitcoin and the S&P, but not doing the exact same thing because we've had this negative correlation between the two as they're diverging, which means we're likely forming another top. But take a look. The FOMC meetings with the Fed have been calling the turns with Bitcoin and the S&P. Right now, we're getting this divergence between the two. But look at this. I mean, with Bitcoin right here, the S&P in a second, I think we're going to either, with Bitcoin, you already got a bottom, okay? You're either going to get a continuation of the trend and try to break higher and either form a top or a bull market. If you're going to get a bull market, the dollar has to collapse. The dollar is bottoming out and breakout and back test at a major primary trend line. Bitcoin is either getting a top or it's going to get a continuation of the trend. The S&P, well, Bitcoin has rallied. The S&P has sold off, so it's going to get a continuation of the trend or it's going to get a bottom. Again, here, just quickly with Bitcoin, we had the June peak right after that. Well, the Fed meeting, and it marked the June top. It marked the May bottom the very day of it. The March peak, and again, the sell-off, and we ended up dropping 23.5%. Over here, 25.5%. It's marked the two peaks, the March peak, the June peak, the May bottom. If Bitcoin sets up another lower high, right here, the market, Bitcoin will likely top. The market will likely bottom, rebound back up. S&P will probably make a higher high. NASDAQ will probably make a lower high, and Bitcoin will probably top out. Now, again, Bitcoin breaks up through this level. You get a bigger move down on the S&P right here. Now, if the negative correlation between them continues. So I'll be watching, but I think you got a good shot. Right now, Bitcoin's rallying up on the Bitcoin conference, as I correctly predicted it would after calling the bottom. It's going to top with a lower high in the low 70,000, around 70 or 71,000. Keeping this in your mind, that Bitcoin's rallied, and we could see a top surrounding the Fed meeting this week now with Bitcoin. We could possibly get a bottom with the S&P. Take a look at this. Before I show you the S&P, look at this. Look at the divergence that's developing right now. Series of lower highs on Bitcoin. Look at over here. Bitcoin peaked over here in 2021. Got a series of lower highs. This is the rally when the S&P topped out. Let me rephrase that. We had a rally on Bitcoin before the S&P topped out. This was in December, and by the time Bitcoin started moving down, the S&P went higher, and then Bitcoin ended up collapsing 52% before it had a meaningful rebound back up. So again, you have a very similar divergence here, but Bitcoin rallied ahead of the S&P, putting in its final peak. Did you hear what I just said? Bitcoin rallied in December, just like NASDAQ rallied in December ahead of the S&P, putting in its final peak that first week in January of 2022. And then it sold off down to collapse by more than half, by 52%. Bitcoin's already dropped 27.5%. If it tops here and it turns down, then again, S&P is likely going to follow. Are you picking up what I'm throwing down? This is absolutely mind-blowing. Hate cryptocurrency, you can hate Bitcoin, but it's telling you, hey, an important piece of information. Keeping this in mind, look at the S&P 500. Look at this. Again, here we had kind of feeble rallies back up. Here we've had more powerful rallies back up. Still, you had the rally ahead of the S&P peaking. January, when the S&P was rallying back up, Bitcoin was going back down. They had a negative correlation. Keep this in mind over here. Keep this in mind. I'm going to show you the S&P right now. And keep this in mind. Again, these divergences that are forming with the S&P. Bitcoin, again, likely going to get a top or a continuation with the Fed. My guess is it's going to get a top. I'm getting sell signals right now. I'll show them to you on Bitcoin with the Bitcoin conference. The S&P's probably got a good shot that it's going to bottom pretty quick here, probably next week. As Bitcoin got those lower highs, look what the S&P did. Bitcoin had started dropping in December along with NASDAQ. NASDAQ wasn't making a lower high in January. It had already peaked in December and started going down with Bitcoin. And look at the S&P 500. It went higher and it diverged with Bitcoin at that peak. I think that, again, see another divergence point. We're already getting some with Bitcoin, from Bitcoin peaking in March and the stock market. We're already getting some. I think the S&P is going to go right up into that trend line in all likelihood and peak just slightly above the other high. I think you've got a pretty good shot that they're going to diverge. I think NASDAQ has already topped. I think we're going to go back and fill the gaps in all likelihood, go lower next week, bottom out, and then get a rebound back up to fill these gaps in an overall topping process. Looking for a topping process to complete. But look at the meetings. Again, I told you on the last meeting, we've already had the rally. I told you it was either a top or a continuation. It ended up being a continuation, and we went higher. Now this meeting right now, and we've sold off since then, and we've come back below where that Fed meeting was on June 12th. Now we're going to get another Fed meeting. The market's been turning with the Fed meetings. It's been going tops, bottoms, and continuations of the trend over and over. Top, continuation, bottom, bottom, continuation, continuation, top. And here we had the bottom. Here we had a continuation. So now we've been selling off going into the Fed meeting. So that means we're either going to get a continuation of the trend down. If you do, you've got your head and shoulders pattern in play. Or, and which is possible, Bitcoin tops out and the negative correlation. Did you hear what I just said? If the negative, because usually they have a positive correlation. But if the negative correlation continues, suggesting a topping process, then we could bottom out in the market, go back and fill the gaps, which I think is likely. Our topping process, those gaps are likely going to get filled. So the S&P can move up to a new high, and again, the Fed meeting can call a bottom for the S&P 500 and a reversal, a top for Bitcoin. This is absolutely mind-blowing. The negative correlation between Bitcoin and the S&P could be suggesting a market bottom should Bitcoin top. I'm getting the topping signals right now for Bitcoin. It probably will go higher towards my trend line. Let me show you. Just on Saturday here, as I'm making the video, we just had Saturday session for the Bitcoin conference, again, that has been going on for several days. And with that, we had a doji form on the Bitcoin chart and open decision. I still think Bitcoin's coming up to this trend line right here, which again, whether including the shadow or excluding it. If you exclude it, we're just right under that level. If we exclude the shadow, I still think we're going higher. I warned you that the NASDAQ was topping out in S&P. NASDAQ on July 10th, I was warning you that I had some signals that were warning it was topping. Well, Bitcoin bottomed out right here on July 5th. And again, we got these bottoming signals right after in early July as NASDAQ was topping out. Predicted this rally with Bitcoin. It was confirmed on July 13th. Again, I have a negative correlation. When my Bitcoin signals turned bearish here early June 6th to June 10th, well, guess what? The market was bottoming out and it was rallying back up. Negative correlation right now, and that's likely suggesting a topping process. But right now, look at what's going on with Bitcoin. I predicted right here that Bitcoin was going to pull back, going into the main speakers into the Bitcoin conference, and it did. We had the divergences on the 4-hour chart. It did. But then I predicted a bottom here the other day on the 25th at my 100 period moving average. You got a bottoming tail, and I said we're likely going up to this trend line. So I'm trying to show you If you don't like Bitcoin, I'm not trying to bore you to death. I'm just trying to tell you it's warning that, hey, negative correlation continues, the stock market could bottom. Now, at some point, they're going to start moving back to a positive correlation, probably when this divergence finishes. But look at the signals. We just got it with the close right now. I'll link my Bitcoin video at the end of this one. I it before the close happened, and now that we have the close with the doji, guess what? I'm getting a sell signal right there. Now, I still think we're going to go a little higher. We don't have to. You've got a divergence. We already did. The doji might mark the turn, and we might start reversing ahead of the Fed. Oftentimes, we will peak ahead of the Fed. It did over here. It did over here. It peaked ahead of the Fed, and it topped with the Fed. I still think you got a shot at this trend line, or like I said, if we go a little higher, including the shadow there, or this one excluding the shadow but hitting these other ones, or again excluding all of the shadows, we're pretty much right there. We're right underneath it. So right there, we're right underneath it with the Saturday high. It hit 69,000. We've had 7 failed attempts to get above it. This is now the 8th. Again, I think we go a little higher, but I think it's going to turn here. I think that's suggesting that Bitcoin is going to top and the stock market is going to bottom. I wanted to share that with you. Bitcoin's forming a divergence, a lot of different indicators. Here I have momentum. And again, I've been predicting that Bitcoin would form this divergence, probably going a little bit higher, but you've got the warning signs. You got the warning signs of a top, you got a warning sign of a top. Now you get the sell signal here with the Bitcoin conference, warning that Bitcoin's forming a top. It could still go a little higher, but it's warning of a Bitcoin top. Down here was warning of a Bitcoin bottom, and down over here was warning of a Bitcoin bottom. And again, Bitcoin's topping, the stock market is either going to get a continuation of the trend back into a positive correlation with Bitcoin, or it's going to bottom out, rounding the Fed meeting. Again, I just want to share this to you because I got signals that are warning Bitcoin's trying to form a top here. Maybe it goes a little higher, hits my trend line, just like it did over here in May, over here with the June peak, again, the little miniature double top there, over here in March, and these bottoms. Again, it's called the tops and bottoms beautifully. Look at that, peak of stinking boo. And again, the divergence may or may not be done yet. My guess is it's probably not done, but I think we'll complete it. In the weekly time frame, Bitcoin's going to get a hanging man, the divergence with the S&P, and turn down, completing the divergence on momentum and other things like the money flow and the RSI and other indicators. You've got a lot of different indicators that are forming divergences. Could still go higher, and I think that sellers are going to be lurking here. So I just wanted to show you that because, again, correlation continues to be negative between the stock market and Bitcoin. If Bitcoin's getting topping signals, S&P is either going to get bottoming signals or they're going to go back into a positive correlation, and you'll get a continuation of the trend on the S&P down to 4,900, NASDAQ down to 17,000. If we breach the trend lines, like Bitcoin did, it breached the trend line right here, and again, but it rebounded back up and got back above it. If we see the same thing with the NASDAQ and the S&P, then they can follow Bitcoin back up to fill the gaps, and then Bitcoin could top out and turn back down, break this accelerated trend line, and then you got yourself. And here's the RSI. RSI is forming a possible divergence here. Talk about it. If Bitcoin breaks through this level and gets a continuation, won't have that divergence with the S&P, but I'm just telling you, it's very possible. Again, if you look at the trend lines, Bitcoin broke the trend line from this low right here. It got back above it. S&P and NASDAQ are probably going to break it decisively and then get back above it, just like Bitcoin. That's why I think next week we'll get divergences. About my last video, but then I think we'll get a rebound. Eventually, I think they're all going to head back towards these trend lines, these longer-term trend lines on S&P and NASDAQ. But the Bitcoin chart here looks very similar to the S&P chart right here. And let me just zoom in on this area for the S&P so you can see it. So I think we breach the trend line and then get back above it and go make new highs. It's a close-up I've been showing you of it. And again, here's that, again, October 2023 low. Again, we slightly violated it, got back above it. I think you're going to push down into the cloud right here, moving closer to that 100 period moving average. Again, and then I think you're going to try to get back above this level. So again, I have a head and shoulders formation here. The head may be up here if we, again, come back up here and try to fill the gap up here from the and the gap was at the very top, so I think it's going to get filled. So I think that eventually NASDAQ's going to go back up. The question is right now with the Fed meeting that has been calling the turns in the market, do we get a continuation of the trend going down to the 200 and down here, if we do, it's less likely we're going to fill those gaps. Or do we go a little bit lower maybe, or try to bounce off the trend line? I think we go a little lower, and then we go back up, and then we get the big sell-off going into September. You'll get your Fed up, but historically, you get a bounce. Usually, it's a small bounce, and the Fed pivots. That's what people, I mean, if you look at history. So here's the S&P. The point I'm trying to make is the S&P can break the trend line that I just talked about earlier in the video and still come closer to the 100 period moving average, but still try to bottom out surrounding that level, end up getting back above the trend line to go back up and try to fill the gap at the very top. That's the point I'm trying to make. The Fed meeting, having gotten a sell-off, either going to get a bottom developing around the Fed, or we'll get a continuation that will take us down here, as I've talked about, with a possible head and shoulders forming now rather than later. If we're going to form a top, which I believe we are, then you got a good shot at filling the gaps, or we get a bigger drop. But again, signals remain bearish, we could continue lower. So if Bitcoin's topping, well, that negative correlation continues between the market and with Bitcoin. Now here, again, I warned you about these topping signals before we had the sell-off. I warned you we started getting topping signals, and then we gapped lower, and we started seeing more topping signals, and that was followed with the trend signals turning bearish. Those signals were becoming very oversold, like here with momentum, we're becoming oversold. And again, it could be we attempt to breach the trend line, but then rebound back up. Let me be clear, my signals remain bearish, and we don't see attempted recovery with the divergence on the 60-minute charts. Then, all bets are off. We can still go lower and form the head and shoulders right now. I just think you got a good shot of a bottom developing. Term bottom to go back and fill the gaps. I have topping signals that are forming on Bitcoin. I don't have bottoming signals quite yet here on the S&P 500. The X is warning of a possible coming bottom, but that's the only one I have. I think it's possible if we form bullish divergences and go lower, on next week we can bottom ahead of the Fed or maybe with the Fed and get a bottom next week. S&P 500 and NASDAQ will need to see bottoming signals begin to develop like we had over here, and then eventually being confirmed, shift in momentum, and eventually the trend. So again, we'll be watching. Coin forms a top, you got a shot. If the negative correlation continues with the S&P, you got a shot at a bottom with the S&P and the NASDAQ. One other thing about the S&P 500, do you see this line right here? It's going flatlined. That is suggesting to me, it's not going down yet, okay? Suggesting to me we might try to find a bottom around the 100 period moving average and come back up and get back above that level. It's going flatline, which is suggesting a possible topping process. Over here, we moved back to it and we bounced off of it. Okay, it acted as support. Here we violated it, but it's going flatline. We may get a big rally back up. If we go down further, we start seeing bottoming signals begin to form. Again, we may attempt to come back up and get above that line right there and start seeing signals flip back to bullish. I think you got a good shot. S&P is going to go back and try to fill a gap because the gap was at the very top. So I think that you got a pretty good shot it's going to try to do it. Look at NASDAQ. NASDAQ got a warning sign right here saying, hey, be on the lookout for a bottom. Now, again, this little red circle, it can continue to go down on the next bars, but it's saying, hey, could get a bottom soon. Over here, I warned you about the signal here. Got that signal on the very day of the top on July 10th. Again, the signal could change and go down with the coming bars that we're going to get next week. It can move. Warning, hey, be on the lookout for a bottom. Okay. Over here we got the signal, but it only gave us a pullback. Okay, as I've talked about, these signals only gave us pullbacks with the NASDAQ. This one has given us a bigger reversal. The trend signals changed. But now we're becoming oversold here with momentum, which again, momentum validated this move. I think NASDAQ's going to go break the trend line along with the semiconductors. Again, you could still bottom out in the 18,000 area. We got up at 18,653, or the 61-point Fibonacci at 18,400, rounding up. Signals back up at the top. I warned you about these signals before the selling ever started. We had warning signs. Again, the divergence was forming on indicators. We had the divergence here with momentum and on other signals. Just telling you, again, we could see with the Fed either a bottom or a continuation. If we get the continuation, you may get your head and shoulders and continue to drop. Okay, but And that would take NASDAQ way down to the 17,000 area, okay? But if we can bottom out here, you got a shot at going back, filling these gaps, getting a lower high, and forming a divergence between the NASDAQ and S&P, a larger divergence on the weekly charts. We already had one at the top back up here. Again, NASDAQ got a lower high right here. S&P got a higher high, as I talked about them diverging back then at the time. And I'll be watching, can we form a bottom, violating those trend lines that I talked about, as Bitcoin did, but then getting back above them as Bitcoin did, back and filling these gaps. Share that with you. A little bit more.